Hey, what is happening everyone? Welcome back to another video, and this is the PSP 2000 disassembly, reassembly, cleanup, and lubrication video. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So yeah, I'll be showing you how to take it apart step by step, show you exactly where each screw goes, and what it looks like, as well as showing you how to clean up all the various parts, and how to lubricate and possibly fix your UMD. But of course, before we get started, there are a couple things that you want to do. If you just got this PSP, then you want to go ahead and test it out. Otherwise, if you already know your PSP works fine, then you can go ahead and skip this part. So that being said, grab your battery, memory card, and UMD, and let's get into it. Now we can actually go ahead and test the majority of the basic functions of the PSP without having any memory cards or UMDs. And here's how you do it. So the first thing we can test out are the D-pads. So we can go left, right, we can go up and down. We can see that the D-pad is working just fine. Volume up and down are also working fine. The brightness switch is also working. And if we go ahead and hold down the note button, we can see that it's going to switch to mute. Now we can go ahead and head over to the internet browser and hit circle for Japanese units and X for North American units. So now we can go ahead and hit the triangle, and we can see that's working. Now we can hit square, and that's also working just fine. Hitting select, we can see that's working as well. And hitting home also works just fine. And now hit triangle to go back to the section, and we can go ahead and test out the analog stick. And what you're looking for here is consistency, moving in the right direction, and moving at the same speed no matter where you're actually going. And if you let go, it should not be drifting, it should stay perfectly still where you left it. And I believe we have 3 more buttons to test out, so we can go ahead and hit triangle, hit up to enter the address bar, and hit OK. And now we can go ahead and type whatever, and then we can go ahead and test out the triggers. So we can see that's working just fine. Again, select is also working. And finally, we have the start button, and if we click it, we can see that's working just fine, which will bring us to the Wi-Fi connection. If you have your Wi-Fi switch, which is located on the top left right here, to the off position, then you will not be able to see any networks. So what you want to do here is make sure that it's actually clicking correctly and it's not loose, and set it to the right position. And now we can go ahead and hit new connection, and we should see some Wi-Fi networks. Now the majority of them are going to be grayed out, which is a good thing because that means your Wi-Fi is running a secure network. The downside is that your PSP is too old and it doesn't support the modern security measures. The best way to go about it is to go ahead and set up a mobile hotspot without any security. But I'll have a video about that and how to do it the most safe way possible, so stick around for that. So for now, we can see that the Wi-Fi is working, it is seeing some networks, and that's about it as far as the testing goes. And while we're here, we're going to go ahead and install these two. For the memory card, the logo is going to face you, and make sure you use this notch right here. And for the UMD, the logo should be facing the outside, and here's what it sounds like. And that's what a relatively healthy UMD should sound like. Now it's not absolutely perfect, but it works pretty well. The loading speeds are pretty good. It's not too noisy. And in my opinion, for its age, not bad at all. However, if you have a faulty UMD, it's going to have a bunch of crunchy noises, it's going to take forever to load, and you'll quickly know that there's something wrong. However, if it does actually load, but it takes too long, then there's a pretty good chance you can actually clean it up and make it work just as good as this unit that I have right here. The last thing left to do is to go ahead and test out the memory card so we can already see that it's reading. And that's all you want to see. Plug in the memory card, it should show up here or ask you to format it, and in our case it is working just fine. Alright, so we are good to go. Let's go ahead and start the disassembly process. Start off by removing the battery cover, the battery, the memory card if you had any, and likewise with any UMD that may have installed. And before moving forward, I want to give you the best tip of your life if this is your first time working with screwdrivers and small devices, is that you definitely don't want to strip your screw. Because the last thing you want is a strip screw when you're just getting started. And using the wrong screwdriver for the wrong screw, well, you're pretty much screwed. And how to test it out is you want to go ahead and grab whatever screwdrivers you have, and basically place them on top of a screw that you can easily see, such as this one right here. If it's gripping nicely and the screw is moving along with it just fine, then that's a sign of a good screwdriver and the correct type of tip for the right screw. However, what you don't want to hear is this. Now, of course, I could use it if I wanted by adding extra pressure, but that's just extra risk that you don't want to get into. So please don't use a screwdriver if it's slipping and making noises like that. Put it away, that's just not the right one. And no, it's not just about getting a high quality screwdriver, it's about getting the right tip for the right screw. I should mention that if your screw is actually rusted and you're using one of these cheap screwdrivers that are making those noises, well, that's a perfect recipe for disaster. So please don't get yourself into that situation because it's no fun. With that being said, if you don't have any tools, I'll leave links for them in the description down below, along with everything that I talk about in this video. Oh yeah, I should also mention, if you got one of these things, make sure you go ahead and use it because it's going to make your life so much easier. It's basically a magnetizer, meaning that you can go ahead and magnetize whatever tool you have, so screws can actually stick to your screwdriver and not fall off while you're actually putting them back in. So makes your life a whole lot easier and you don't need this specific one. You can basically use whatever magnet you have at home and it will do the exact same job. All you have to do is basically do this to your tip and it will become magnetized. That way I could do something like this and easily put back any screw that I have. Now if you're skilled enough, all you need is a screwdriver. However, a pry tool will be handy, same with the tweezers, maybe a small flathead, but you can get that with the kit. Again, the magnetizer tool, some 99% rubber alcohol, but at that point, we're kind of falling into the cleaning category, which some old brush, maybe a toothbrush, will become very useful. And for the lubrication process, some dielectric grease and some super lube, which I use for my mechanical keyboards. And finally, a little container where I can put some soap and water to clean up all the little parts. And with all that preparation talk out of the way, let's finally begin removing some screws, starting with these two. Now these are two tiny screws that are only used on the top here. You will not find them on the inside and you will not find them anywhere else on this console. That being said, depending on which unit you have, you may have a T2 star or a Phillips head. And in my experience, T2 stars usually come with Japanese units and Phillips head screws are used with North American models. So if you get yourself one of these toolkits, then it'll definitely come in handy. As always, links will be in the description down below. Now let's move over to the screws on the back, and the only thing you need to take note of is the bottom left screw. This one is usually covered by a little sticker. Usually people just unpeel the sticker. I personally like to keep it and just access a screw right through the sticker. That way I don't have to deal with an ugly patch. And here's an example of what it usually looks like on a PSP 3000 unit. The screw is usually right around here. You can kind of poke around with it and try to unscrew until you find it, or just simply remove the sticker, which will leave a bunch of marks that look a little something like this. So again, it's just to the bottom right of the actual charging port right over here. And lastly, the bottom screw. And once again, these screws are all unique and you'll only be using them on the outside, as they are all silver. 2 small ones and 5 bigger ones. And don't worry about it because you don't have to remember this, as we'll be doing the reassembly as well and showing you exactly where each screw goes. So now that all the screws have been removed, we can go ahead and pop open the faceplate. We can start off on the right side, making sure that you take extra care of this side, as there's a little tiny clip that could easily snap off if done incorrectly. So one way to go about it is to simply pry it open like so, and that should be enough to safely remove it. And here's what it looks like on a silver model. So do make sure you take care of it, as if you lay it flat on a table like this and add just a tiny bit of pressure on the right side, it could easily fold in on itself and eventually break. And if it does break, it's not that big of an issue, but if you want your original fitment, then you want to take care of it. Slowly work your way around it until it's fully free, just like so. Now at this point, we can go ahead and grab the little container that I got, and we can start removing the parts from the faceplate if we want to go ahead and clean them up. So we got the D-pad rubber dome, the actual D-pads, and unlike the PSP 1000, the face buttons should just come right out into one piece. If one of them is broken, then you're pretty much screwed and you need to order a new port, because these ones you cannot glue back together. You pretty much need to find an original one if you want to have a good experience. As for the media buttons, there's a little piece of adhesive right in the middle, and you can just spray into it some 99% isopropyl, or you can heat it up with a hairdryer and it should just pop right out. Now this one I should mention, with the 2000 models, you may find these metal pieces on the top of the display. They're not important. If they fall out, you can keep them off or remove them yourself. In fact, you won't even see them on the 3000 models anymore, even though it's using the exact same footprint. But either way, they're not very important. And that's pretty much it for the faceplate. If your lens is scratched, you can go ahead and replace it with a glass lens, which I do have a video on that you can find in the description down below. Otherwise, if you're doing a shell swap, then you definitely want to actually keep these things around, because these will function a whole lot better than whatever you get with a shell swap. Next up, we got the analog stick, and we can just pop that right out. And while we're here, we can go ahead and remove the triggers. The trigger retainers should just come right out, and the same thing for the triggers themselves. Now let's move over to the media bar and the display. Now for the media bar here, you can actually use your fingers and just kind of pull at it from the right side until it pops right out. Then I like to hold it out and push to the left, and that should disconnect as well. Now it's going to dangle like this. Next up, we're going to go ahead and free the display. So we got 4 clips. We got one over here, one down here, another one here, and one over here. So what I like to do without having to go too crazy about it is to just push from the top left and push it inwards diagonally. That should just come right out. And the same thing for the left side. Easy peasy. Now, a lot of people like to just actually hold the display like so and then remove the ribbon cables, but that can sometimes be risky if you're new. So what I like to do is to get yourself a folded piece of microfiber cloth and fold it in to be half the height of the PSP, in which you can go ahead and fold out the display and let it rest just like that. And then you can easily take your time to remove these ribbon cables, as these connectors are very fragile and they're very prone to breaking. Sometimes they'll be just fine, and sometimes you're just not lucky, and the PSP has been through a lot of heat cycles in which the plastic becomes very brittle. And here's what those look like up close. This one right here is going to be the media buttons. Now you could use a tool But what I recommend is if you have some nails, is to go ahead and do it with your nail, as you have a bit more leverage and a bit more control and less chance of something slipping and possibly causing some damage. That should just come right out. Now the display connector here seems like it's a bit tough, so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of lift it off bit by bit. Until it fully pops out. So that's my first time doing this in this method, and I think that's a pretty good way to go about it and reduces the risk of breaking this connector. So the slanted edge is facing you, and you just slowly pry at it bit by bit until you get all the edges to the same height, and then you go at it again until the whole thing just pops right open. So that's the display connector. The tiny one right beside it is actually the backlight connector, so that one actually flips the other way around. Very easy. Alright, so one quick note about the display here, you'll see me pulling it straight down where the cable is fully extended. What I recommend you do is that you actually lift the display ever so slightly and ease out the cables that way. That is so we can reduce the amount of stress being caused to the connector and the display cable. That is of course if you're using this method where the display is resting on a platform, in my case a soft microfiber cloth. Because there's of course the possibility of user error, so again lift it up ever so slightly and ease it out. Anyways, let's get back into it. Wiggle it until it comes out like that. And set it aside somewhere safe, preferably with a microfiber cloth, so there's no dust or particles that can come in contact with it. Next up we have the display retainer, and this one can sometimes look a little different, but it usually has these notches that sit on the outside edge of the motherboard, and just kind of slip in like so. Again, I recommend you take a picture to see what it looks like, in case you need more detail of where it should sit. Next up we have this little speaker rubber, and this one is usually stuck to the actual face buttons, but since I already removed this PSP once, and I'm re-recording this video, well, you can see that's already been separated, so you can just remove that and put it into the cleaning bin. Next up we have this little RF shield, and we can just unpeel it with the sticker that it has, and set it aside. And we can go ahead and get started with the left side. So we have one screw right down here, and we can go ahead and remove it, as well as a ribbon cable right over here. Next up we want to open up the memory card slot, and just wiggle the whole thing until it comes out. And you'll notice that the left trigger is actually using adhesive, so you want to go ahead and loosen it up with a hair dryer or some isopropyl. And then what I like to do is to use my pry tool and slowly and carefully and gently pry it out. So what we got here is a plastic piece that's holding down the memory card retainer. We've got the left speaker, while the D-pad and left trigger are made up of the same ribbon cable. So this thing just kind of folds out to the back and then terminates into a single cable here. So set that aside, not in the cleaning bin. Moving over to the right side, we got quite a lot going on. We can start off with the speaker. So it's being held down with this little retainer right here. We can just move that to the left and then just pop right out. Then we can go ahead and remove the Wi-Fi antenna. And you can just leave that hanging like that. We got the face button / power button retainer right over here. Pop that open. And now we can go ahead and remove these two screws. This part should just pop right out. You can leave it connected or disconnected through the ribbon cable. It's really up to you. Next up we got the charging port, and the only thing holding it now is actually the sticker on the back. So this adhesive is kind of keeping it into place. And what we can do here is kind of loosen it up by throwing some 99% ribang alcohol. And we can encourage it by pushing it in from the outside until you get a little grip, and they can just pop it right out. Now please don't remove the cable like so. You're going to definitely break it. These are very prone to breaking and they are very fragile. So what I recommend is you work your way through it with a small screwdriver until it just pops out like so. Next up we got the ribbon cable that is being held down by adhesive once again, and with a hairdryer or 99% isopropyl. If this part is really dirty, then I don't recommend using isopropyl because you can move around the dirt and it might end up actually breaking it. But if yours is pretty clean, it's usually pretty safe to do so. I should also mention there's some serial number that will get melted down with it, so have some tissue handy. Now before we go ahead and remove it, I do want to mention that this part is actually made up of two separate layers. So it's a sandwich of two films. And if you accidentally go in between them, you might actually break it. So make sure that you're actually going under the film on the bottom and not in between the two films. Otherwise, you're going to end up damaging this ribbon cable, and that's no fun. Again, you can use isopropyl or a hairdryer. It's really up to you. Or you can be a savage and just remove it without using anything. And that should look a little something like this. And a quick pointer, I highly don't recommend you buy the aftermarket parts. They usually are very broken, they don't work, and the ribbons are much thicker than the original ones. So if you do have an issue with either of these two ribbons, I highly recommend you get an original part because you're going to be wasting your time and money with the aftermarket stuff. Next up we have the Wi-Fi antenna. Now you could leave it if you're just cleaning your PSP, you don't have to remove it. However, if you're doing a shell swap, then you're going to definitely have to remove it, and here's how you do it. Also, if you end up with this little part right here that falls out, it's not necessary, but it's definitely useful. It basically sits right over here, and it's kind of a spacer for the display to sit on, basically to give it some backbone. Now to make it easier to see, we can actually go ahead and rub this area until we get an imprint of the Wi-Fi antenna. And now we have an outline of the actual antenna, so we can easily cut around it and extract it that way. You can do it with some cutters. I'm just going to go ahead and do it with my pry tool. It's got a nice sharp edge. And now to remove it, you actually have to start from this outside edge right here. Of course, a little bit of isopropyl alcohol would be helpful, and a pair of cutters would be helpful as well to get a nice cutout, but I'm just rolling with it, don't really care, because I'm going to be replacing the shell anyways. Now you can try to clean it up if you want, but don't go too crazy on it, because once you do shell swap it, you'll have another sticker to put on top, so all this residue will be hidden anyways. So go ahead and set that aside. Next up for the motherboard, we have two connectors right here, so let's go ahead and disconnect them. And these two connectors are both for the UMD, so one opens up like so. As for this one, it just flips up, and that's pretty much it. So now what you want to do is to start prying it out from the bottom, and then carefully pull it out. So yeah, pretty straightforward with the motherboard. There's no screws directly holding it, which is really nice. One of the easiest disassemblies in my opinion. And things you want to watch out for are these little sensors right here. You definitely don't want this caught on anything like a microfiber cloth where it just yanks it and breaks it, because these are important for the UMD. Other than that, we do have an expired supercapacitor which holds the time for the PSP. So if you remove the battery and it's not keeping the time when you put it back in, then that's your problem right here. And I'll have a dedicated video covering where to buy these parts and how to replace them. So stick around for that. So yeah, carefully set it aside and let's finish off this disassembly. Lastly, we have one last screw, and it's located right over here, which holds the analog stick. Now one thing about this analog stick is that you don't want to lose this little jelly piece that is placed right on top of these contacts. This piece of jelly has 4 metal rods that bridge the connection between the motherboard and the analog stick. And if you lose it, damage it, or even change the orientation sometimes of how it was sitting, you'll end up with a drifting stick, and that's no fun. So make sure you don't lose it, keep it as is, don't even touch it. If the stick is dirty, just brush it off. Other than that, just set it aside safely and make sure that that piece is going nowhere. Next up we have another RF shield on the bottom. And I guess I lied, there's actually one more screw. That holds the headphone jack / video out port. Finally, for the last piece of electronic to remove from this console would have to be the UMD. So right now there's a retainer right here that holds down the actual spring mechanism. And what you want to do here is to first remove the retainer that holds the spring latch. So this is the part that gives you that satisfying closing action. And to remove it, you simply just hold it like so and pull it out. Now flip it over and we get to the fun part, which is removing the UMD door. Now there's many ways to go about it, and I'll show you both ways. One way is to actually use something like this, maybe a flathead, and basically you want to place it right around here and then you can simply pry it out. Or you could do a combination of that plus bending the console, bending the body ever so slightly, like so. Which is kind of risky because as you can see, it did fracture a little bit right here, but that's perfectly fine. You can super glue it or leave it as is. So let me go ahead and put it back together and show you how to take it apart with a screwdriver. One way you can go about it is do it from this angle and push in until it comes out. And the benefit of this angle is that if you have any damage marks, they won't show up on the outside, so that's a bonus. As for the hinge, you simply slide it up and it's removed. And to remove the actual retainer, you'll notice that there are actually 2 rubber cubes on each side to stop it from coming apart. You simply pull those off, and that's what they look like. Then you simply move it to the side. Same thing with the other one. And finally, we have 4 more screws that hold the UMD in place. And these ones are the next set of unique screws. So they are flat, they're gray colored, and they're pretty round. And you can ease it out from here and simply pull it out like so. Now for the UMD, you want to make sure that you don't lose these rubber grommets, so you don't take extra care with them. So we're going to be setting it aside and showing you how to clean it up in just a bit. And all it's left to do is to go ahead and remove these trim pieces and some extra mechanics. So this part should just come out like so in 2 pieces. That's 1. They should just slide right out. That's 2. And for the top part, you can go about it a couple ways. One way is you can try to pop it open. Sometimes you can just slide it to the side and open it like that. And again, if your console is crusty, then it's going to be extra tough. So keep that in mind. And we'll set these trim pieces aside into the cleanup bin. Now at this point, you can keep the shell as is if you're looking to reuse it. However, if you're looking to shell swap, then you'll definitely want to recover the spring lock mechanism for the UMD, as some shells don't have these pieces included. So the first thing you'll want to remove is this plastic hinge. And there are two clips right here that you want to push in. And once you do that, they should just pop right out alongside with this tiny spring, which you definitely don't want to lose if you want your UMD slot to close properly. And finally, if your replacement shell doesn't have these pieces, then you definitely want to recover them. These are the retainer pieces that lock in your GPS module, TV module, as well as the cameras and microphones. Definitely recover those, and to remove those, you want to place some screwdriver and move it over to the side like so. And they should just come right out. And that's what they look like. And that's pretty much it. We pretty much have stripped down this entire shell. There's absolutely nothing left on it. And the same goes with the faceplate. And now let's move on to the cleaning process. So we have most of the parts here. Of course, we have the case as well. And the last thing that we can actually toss in here would have to be the memory card cover, which you can remove by pushing it out and lifting it off the retainers that can be seen over here. And basically all you need here would have to be some soapy water, and any type of brush. Let it soak in there for a minute, and then you can go ahead and start scrubbing. Oh, we forgot these two. Now, of course, the unit that I have on hand today isn't very dirty. It's not that bad, actually, and doesn't really require all that much cleaning, but hey, might as well show you how to do it properly. You want to take note of any dirt particles that are very stuck. Sometimes there are crevices where the logos are, and once it's wet, it's hard to see what's going on, so make sure you take note before you actually soak it. That way you know where to do some extra scrubbing. Now this power switch can be removed, so go ahead and remove it. Slide it over to the left and lift it up. And usually that's where a lot of grime is stuck in there. Now sometimes the barcode is worn out and it doesn't look all that great, so you can go ahead and remove it. You can unpeel it and then start scrubbing it with your fingers until all the glue is removed. And if it's stubborn, you can dry it off and use some isopropyl. These are some common places where dirt is stuck, so go ahead and give it some extra cleaning. And if you need, you can go ahead and use a Q-tip. And if your lens, like this one, is in good condition, then make sure you take care of it. Otherwise, if it is already scratched, you can go ahead and watch my lens replacing video where we upgraded to a glass lens, which makes it a whole lot sturdier and a whole lot nicer to look at. All around the edges. I know that there are some really grimy PSPs in the past that I had to clean up, and the edges get pretty dirty. Especially with the analog stick, it can get pretty disgusting, so give it some brushing, and my favorite way to clean it up is to get some isopropyl and any old microfiber cloth and just scrub it. And as for the media buttons here, they are pretty fragile, so be extra careful. That's why I'm doing it on my palm. It gives me extra grip, keeps it in place, and I can easily scrub it without having to worry about it ripping into pieces. However, if it is ripped into pieces or 3, don't worry about it, you can put it back together just fine. And I'll show you how to do it. So yeah, once everything is done here, we can go ahead, rinse it off, and set it aside to dry. Then I'll show you how to clean up the various electronics and how to lubricate and fix your UMD that's making a bunch of noise and taking forever to load. Alright, so now that these parts are cleaned up, let's go ahead and move on to the electronics. Starting with the motherboard. In my case, it's pretty clean. However, if yours is pretty dirty, then what you can do is to go ahead and just go over it with a brush on this side. Just lightly dust it. As for the bottom, you want to be extra careful with this part right here, as well as that part, because these are micro switches that are crucial for your UMD function. And if you want, you can just dust it upwards like so, and that should be enough. If your clock supercapacitor is looking like this, I would recommend that you don't touch it, leave it as is, until you're ready to actually replace it, which I will have a dedicated video on later on in the future. At this point, if your USB port is dirty, or it's not connecting properly on your computer, then go ahead and inspect it. And if it has any dirt or rust, then you want to go ahead and clean it up with some contact cleaner, and I would recommend that you go over it with a flathead screwdriver like so, just to lightly scrape off any rust particles. Then you can rinse it off with some isopropyl or some contact cleaner. And the same goes for the SD card slot. If it is rusted or not reading properly, do a visual inspection to make sure that the contacts are clean and they are actually gold colored and not rust colored. You can get a closer look from here. And what you could do if you got a spare card is you could fill it with some contact cleaner and basically go over it like so, wipe it off, drench the whole thing in contact cleaner, and once again go over it like so. And if you got a toothpick on hand, you can go under the contacts carefully and scrape off any rust that you may have. Again, under the contacts, as these contacts are pointing downwards in order to make contact with your memory card. Same thing with your speakers, just dust them off if there's any dust or dirt particles. The Wi-Fi you can leave as is, or if you really want to clean off this residue, even though you're already going to be covering it with another sticker if you're doing a shell swap, you can ease off this layer with some isopropyl. And it should look a little something like this. Dust off your power switch if it's got any dust, and if it's got any liquid damage or some grime, then you can go ahead and rinse it off with some isopropyl and wipe it off. As for the headphone jack, if it's dirty, you can go ahead and grab yourself a Q-tip, dip it in some isopropyl, try to shrink it by pulling off some of the cotton, wetting it with isopropyl, and going over it like so. Same thing was with the power jack if it's dirty, but this time you can get some tissue, give it some isopropyl, and a small screwdriver, crumple it up, and then just go ahead and clean it up like so. Finally, for this part, there's not a whole lot going on. If it is dirty or grimy, just go over it with a quick spray. Not too much, make sure you don't have too much on the speaker as you could damage it. And just clean it off like so. Same goes for this one, just 1-2 quick sprays. And a quick wipe down on the contacts. For the analog stick, we'll have a dedicated video on how to fix it. But for now, if it's working perfectly fine, don't touch it, just make sure that the jelly piece is right there. If anything, you can give it one quick spray and go over it once, and that should be good enough. And finally, we have the UMD. In my case, it's pretty clean, it does work, it functions pretty nicely, and the read speeds are pretty typical. Now, if yours is not working correctly, it's making too much noises, taking forever to load, then here's what you could do. In my case, I'll be using dielectric grease, as well as some super lube, and yes, I've been using these for my mechanical keyboards. You can also use lithium grease and other lubricants. However, although you can use WD-40, I wouldn't recommend it as it wouldn't last for too long before it dries out. So here's what you want to do. We can start off with the easy stuff. Grab your super lube and start adding some right over here, all around these holes that you can find on the primary motor. One quick dab right down here. And for good measures, we can just drop one drop right here. Now flip it over and we're going to add one here, here, in this little opening right here, right around here as well. And then you want to go ahead and spin these around, get them moving, and the same goes for this side, and that should be it for the super lube. Now for the dielectric grease, we're going to start off at the top here. We're just going to add a tiny bit. Same on the rail here. A little bit on this corner, and finally a little bit more on the top here. And that should be it. So now what you want to do is to go ahead and grab this carefully and move it back and forth. Clean off any excess. Give it a few dabs. Just lightly go over the areas that you have lubed. And that should be pretty much it. And that should fix your noisy, very slow to read UMD drive. So now let's go ahead and finally put everything back together. Now just a heads up, all the internal screws on the PSP 2000 model are going to be the black screws. So let's go ahead and get started with these parts, which are the UMD door clip, UMD door clip spring, and the accessory retainers. And we'll start off with these. And the way you insert them is with the protruding hole pointing downwards, while the smooth part is pointing up. So here goes one, and goes in the other. Make sure they're centered, and that's now good to go. Next up we have this piece, and you want to insert it like so, which you start off at the top, and then you push in the bottom parts, until everything clicks into place. Next up, grab your spring, and we're going to go ahead and reinsert it into this cavity, and then push it in, just like so. And now we can see that it's now spring-loaded. Next up, let's go ahead and reinstall the UMD drive. But first, we're going to go ahead and give the sensor a quick wipe. Make sure it's moved all the way to the right position, and you'll want to take note of these two cables. The other one has to pass through right here, while the other one on the bottom has to pass through the other opening. Seat it into place, and while holding it, we can flip it over and double check that the cables are correctly routed. And now we can go ahead and reinstall the screws. Next, let's put back the hinge mechanism, starting from the right side, and then moving on to the left. And we can check that it's moving correctly. Now at this point, you can go ahead and reinstall the rubber bricks, but it is optional, and it's not absolutely necessary. So if you lost them, it's alright. Next, we got the UMD door, and what you want to do here is line up these little prongs with the inside of these circles on the bottom by doing both at the same time. And once both are in, we can see that they're both securely connected. Without letting them touch the bottom of the rail, you'll want to go ahead and insert the right side first, followed by the left. And for this one, you can ever so slightly bend the shell to push it back into place. Now we can see that the UMD door is opening and closing correctly. However, it doesn't have that spring locking action because we still have not installed the spring that sits right over here. And for this part, it can definitely be a little bit tricky, but here's how you should do it. Basically, the spring here has two different size legs, one long one and one short one. The long one attaches to the actual door hinge, we can see right over here, that part right there, while the other one has to go through this little hole and then stick in place into this little retainer. You start off with the bottom one, thread it through, and then you want to carefully and securely grab the long leg, which isn't very easy to do with a pair of tweezers, and push it right into there. And to keep it in place, we use this little plastic piece that we push into place, and that should stop it from popping itself out. And if you've done everything correctly, the door now automatically snaps and has that nice springy action. Very satisfying. And here's what that looks like in action. Now let's go ahead and reinstall the trim pieces back together, starting by putting back in the switches. And for this one, I recommend you start off on the left side, and sliding over to the right, and then you can just push that in, and it should clip back into place. Next, we have the left side, and only then we can go ahead and reinstall the right side. Make sure all the little tabs are going into the right places, and then just clip them into place, finishing off by putting back in the power switch piece. Next up, we got the audio video board, and that should just drop right in, and then we can go ahead and screw it back into place with a single black screw. And while we're here, we're going to go ahead and give these a quick wipe, just in case if we got any debris on them, and then we go ahead and drop in the RF shield. Now moving on to the analog stick, we have the jelly piece. Now before I told you not to touch it, not to remove it, which is still the case, just go over it lightly with the top part with some isopropyl and a Q-tip, clean it up, and that's about it. However, if you accidentally removed it, or it fell out, then you want to go ahead and clean all the contacts for both the analog stick, both sides of the jelly piece, as well as the contacts here on the motherboard. And this is just to decrease the chances of it drifting and cleaning up everything in case there's some residue, because if you don't have proper contact or no stick at all, you will still get stick drift. And by default, it will go to the top left corner. So make sure you clean everything up. Of course, use a clean Q-tip, unlike me. And finally, put it back in this orientation and just ease it into place, giving it one last isopropyl wipe. And then we'll go ahead and drop it right into this corner and screwing it back into place. Next up, we got the motherboard, and there are 5 things I need to take note of. First, we need to insert it from the port side first, so it's going to slide in just like so. You also have to take note of the Wi-Fi switch that is lining up with the plastic piece on the outside. These 2 ribbon cables have to be on top of the motherboard once it's installed. And finally, this little clip right here that will clip into place once the motherboard is inserted. So here we go. In goes with the USB port, line up the Wi-Fi switch, ensure that these 2 ribbons are on the outside, and if everything is lined up correctly, this should just clip right in. And now we can go ahead and reinstall these 2 ribbon cables. Of course, I would highly recommend that you clean them up as well. Just give them one last quick wipe, and they should be good to go. Make sure that these 2 tabs are open, and it should just slide right in with your finger like so, followed by closing both clips at the same time. And that's what it should look like. Next, we got the left assembly. So let's go ahead and insert one leg at a time for the memory card flap. Now the toughest part about this section would have to be the ribbon cable, because of the really tight and short angle. So you want to go ahead and try to work it in, nudge it into place, before you go ahead and drop everything inside. Just take your time with it, there's no rush. But once that is inserted, make sure that the flap is open, and that should just drop right in. And then of course you can go ahead and make sure that it's seated fully, and finally close the flap back up. And once again, although the adhesive here is weak, it's good enough to keep it into place, but if you really wanted, you can give it one small drop of B7000. Or really any other adhesive that you can easily remove. Just make sure you don't use super glue. And secure it into place with a single black screw. Moving on, we got the right assembly alongside of the power switch. So go ahead and give these contacts a quick wipe with some isopropyl, reinstall the connector back into place, and now we can go ahead and line up the center opening with this little prong, as well as the other prong right here, and here. Keep the power switch hanging like this, and now we can go ahead and grab the charging barrel, screw it back into place, grab the power switch, line it up with a slider on the outside, also screw it in. Then you want to feed these 2 cables under this little triangle right here, with the left cable first, followed by the right, and finally plugging it back into place. Now to reinstall the Wi-Fi antenna, you want to make sure that this right trigger is actually hanging out like this. As for the antenna itself, it's fine if it looks like this, just make sure that it's relatively straight and not too bent. And what you want to do here is to go ahead and feed it through like so, having the cable route under the ribbon cable, and on the back it should look a little something like this. Now once again, if you're just cleaning the case, you don't need to remove it. However, if you're looking to shell swap it, then this is something you'll have to do. And to keep it into place, if you're using the same shell and for some reason you decided to remove it, you can use some B7000 or a thin double-sided adhesive to stop it from moving around. And make sure that it's sitting under the ribbon and not on top of the face buttons. Lastly, the cable is going to be routed through here, on top of this little piece, around this little prong, and finally clip back into place into this little connector. Next up, we've got the right side speaker, and the easiest way to do it is to start from the bottom, have it angled to the right side, push it in, and everything should just click back into place, making sure that this little prong is sitting right on top of the speaker tab. Let's go ahead and put back in the corresponding triggers, the right side on the right, left on the left, and do remember that they are labeled. Put back in the retainers, and screw them back into place with the final 2 black screws that you have. Hopefully you didn't lose any of them. Next, we got this RF shield. We'll just drop that right in there and stick it back into place, making sure that all the contacts are sitting correctly. On top of these small golden rectangles, throw this little rubber square right here, the right speaker gasket, ensuring that this top right corner is sitting flat. And now we can go ahead and move on to the media buttons. For now, just leave it hanging like so. And now we can go ahead and grab our display, making sure that both connectors are open and ready to go, and carefully installing them back into place, starting with the backlight connector. So you install the backlight connector, then the display connector, and then you lock them into place. Hold it like so, lock that into place. Same thing with the display connector, reinstalling the spacer here, and then lowering it back in the display, clipping it back into place, and finally clipping the media bar back into it. Now at this point, everything is connected, and now we can go ahead and quickly test it out and ensure that everything is working correctly. And we'll move on to the next step of putting back in the faceplate, which is annoying in its own right because we definitely don't want to trap any dust between the screen and the faceplate. So for now, set that aside, and we'll go ahead and quickly clean it up with some Windex and a microfiber cloth. Making sure, of course, that your microfiber cloth is clean and doesn't have any dust particles. And if you're a gamer guy like me, you should have one of these bulb dusters that help you easily push any dust away. So let's go ahead and toss back in the D-pad, with the cutout part facing the left side, the rubber dome, and no, it doesn't matter what orientation you put it, the face buttons, and finally, the media buttons. Oh yeah, and if you do end up breaking the media buttons into multiple pieces, it's not a problem. You can place them and basically tape them from the outside so they're not moving around. And once you screw everything back in, you can remove the tape and the buttons will stay right where you placed them. And finally, we have the analog stick. So here's how my dust routine goes. I clean up the faceplate, make sure that there's no particles on it, then I keep it flipped around like so while I work on the display. So what I like to do is to first start off by dusting it and do a visual inspection, making sure that there's no more dust, lint, hair, or fingerprints. If I do have any fingerprints, then I want to go ahead and clean it up, shine it against a bright source of light, looking at it at an angle, and making sure that there's no more dust particles. And then you can go ahead and place back in the faceplate and do a visual inspection one last time, making sure that there are no dust particles that bother us. And making sure that this flap, if it's still there, mine broke during the cleaning process, is installed on the inside and is going between the grooves here, which should look a little something like this. And if you found any other dust particles, again, if you have this tool, it's super handy. Give it a quick blow before giving it the final close. And now we can finally go ahead and start screwing back in the outer screws. Now I should mention, if your screws are dirty or a little bit rusted, of course, you can go ahead and clean them up. You can use some WD-40, clean them up with a tissue to give them a slightly cleaner look. And would you look at that? We are finally done. Power it back up. And let's go ahead and test out the UMD with a different game this time and take a listen of what it sounds like now. And with that being said, that is all for this video. So this video was supposed to be kind of a warm-up since I haven't uploaded in like 75 days. As soon as this one is uploaded, I'm going to start working on the ARC 4 video. Going to start from scratch, redo everything I've already worked on, and then we can finally get back to hardware modding, which I'm really looking forward to because we're finally getting to the juicy stuff. And of course, do expect videos like this one for the 3000, E1000, and PSP Go, as well as a reassembly video for the 1000 model because I've already done a teardown but no reassembly, so I think that's going to be pretty helpful for a lot of people. Other than that, really loving how this console is feeling right now. Just knowing that it's been cleaned inside out just makes it feel all that more enjoyable to play on. And that whatever dirt it had on it for the past decade is no longer there. So yeah, with that being said guys, that is all for this video. Links for everything will be in the description down below. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care everyone.